Hi viewers, this is Angela Murjani from Kasturba Gandhi College in Hyderabad. I welcome you all to today's session when we are going to study a poem by an American poet called Adrien Rich. It's a feminist poem, so if you are interested in those kind of issues, you're going to find this poem extremely interesting and down your very street today. Adrien Rich was born in 1929 and for more than the last 70 years has been one of America's most loved and important poets. Most of her poetry comes out of her natural everyday experiences. And you will find that one theme that keeps recurring in her poetry is the tension that exists between men and women, which stems primarily out of husbands wanting to dominate their spouses. This has led Adrien Rich very naturally into the realm of feminist writing. Rich was brought up in a well-off family of mixed parentage, Jewish and Protestant, and this itself led to much tension that was reflected in many moments of heavy silence in their household. She lived in the day when there were fixed expectations between husbands and wives, and it was very common for men to dominate their women, and women were expected to live a life of subservience to their husbands. All of these elements are reflected in the poem Aunt Jennifer's Tigers that we are going to be studying today. In fact, the main image in this poem is of a husband who terrorizes and dominates his wife to the extent where she has to find an alternative imaginary world in which to escape in order to just be able to cope with the situations of her life. The poem has two main themes. In the first theme, Adrien Rich explores this woman who is helpless in a marriage in which she is being dominated by a husband who fails to see her needs and her wants. She feels suffocated by the unwritten rules that society restrains her with, and she feels constrained and trapped in a marriage that appears to her to be going nowhere. Adrien Rich portrays the sadness of Aunt Jennifer through the poem. Rich was fascinated by people who could use a hobby like artwork in order to create another world. So in this poem, she explores the idea of how people who are unable to cope with life situations create a world in which there is happiness, peace, joy, comfort, all the things which they are missing in their real world, and this imaginary world becomes to them more real than their real world. An important aspect of this poem is the feminist concerns that are expressed by Rich through it. It's pretty clear through the poem that the main issue that Adrien Rich is wanting to address is gender bias. She is terribly upset by the unequal equation between men and women, and it is very disturbing to her to see how in a male-dominated world, men will use every opportunity to subjugate and oppress women. Rich is sharply critical of men who force women to create another world, a world in which they can find peace, happiness, and the aspirations and the dreams that they hold dear to themselves, even if they can escape into this world only temporarily because it is imaginatively and aesthetically constructed. The poem was written in the 1950s, an era which is very different from the times in which we live. In those days, roles and expectations for people were dictated on the basis of gender. So, there were certain things that only men could do. Freedom, adventure, domination, all of these roles were relegated to the men, whereas the women got the more subjugated roles to play. Roles of nurturing, those roles that indicated that they would be in the household, these things were saved for the women. In such a situation, Aunt Jennifer finds herself in a conventional marriage where society imposes upon her several rules, not written but understood. And when she fails to be able to keep up to these expectations, she feels trapped. She feels like she wants out. But in that day and age, there was no going out. She had to remain within the confines of this marriage, which to her was suffocating and strangulating. The feminist concerns in this poem are expressed through a number of images that are all linked to these assumptions which are based upon gender, and we will look at a few of them now. Aunt Jennifer, whom we do see in the poem, is portrayed as the victim. Uncle, whom we do not see and who never appears in the poem, is represented by the wedding ring. The wedding band or the wedding ring stands for oppression, law, custom, tradition, everything in fact which is responsible for Aunt Jennifer's misery. The overbearing heaviness of her wedding ring seems to place all the guilt and blame for Aunt Jennifer's suffering on her husband. In fact, the train of this thread continues through the poem. We see it in the first stanza as the fear which Aunt Jennifer expresses for her husband. In stanza 2, it appears as an implied slavery that she feels. She almost thinks that she is in bondage to him of some kind. And in the last stanza, even in death, Aunt Jennifer speaking through her death about the ordeals that she had to suffer at the hands of her husband. Gender-based role segregation is represented through certain activities in the poem. The men are the ones who go hunting, and they are the ones who are able to keep the animals in hiding, even driving them up the trees. Even the tigers are presented as masculine figures with their chivalric certainty. This is done deliberately to contrast them with the hesitancy and the lack of confidence that was customarily demonstrated by women in that era. The ivory needle again speaks of male dominance because apparently it would have come out of the hunting expedition of one of the male members of the family who would have been in Africa, bringing in the themes of colonialism and imperialism, which are very important in the structure of this poem. Just as the tigers are a projection of Aunt Jennifer in the panel, so the men in the panel are a projection of Uncle. The tigers are not afraid of the men, whereas in real life, Aunt Jennifer is terrified of men. The men don't seem to intimidate the tigers at all, but in real life, she is terribly daunted by her husband and lives in constant dread and fear of him. Aunt Jennifer's Tigers appears in the first collected volume of Adrien Rich's poems. It represents a typical product of her earlier work. It is a poem that has 3 stanzas, and each stanza is a quatrain. A quatrain, as you probably know, is a verse that has 4 lines. Each of these quatrains is made up of 2 couplets. A couplet is a verse again of 2 lines and comes from the same word as couple, and the couplet has an internal rhyme scheme. Technically, the poem demonstrates flawless craftsmanship with an excellent attention to meter and rhyming couplets. Aunt Jennifer's Tigers by Adrien Rich. Aunt Jennifer's tigers prance across a screen, bright topaz denizens of a world of green. They do not fear the men beneath the tree. They pace in sleek chivalric certainty. Aunt Jennifer's fingers flutter through her wool, find even the ivory needle hard to pull. The massive weight of Uncle's wedding band sits heavily upon Aunt Jennifer's hand. When Aunt is dead, her terrified hands will lie, still ringed with ordeals she was mastered by. The tigers in the panel that she made will go on prancing, proud and unafraid. The poem portrays the central character of Aunt Jennifer as somebody who is very meek, passive, and writhing under the pain of being subdued by a husband who seems to be an angry and an oppressive man. She feels the bounds of society around her and cannot tolerate them, yet at the same time cannot do anything about them. In Aunt Jennifer, you find two kinds of people. One who is listening to society, telling her you ought to do this, you should do that, this is how you must behave. And on the other hand, within her was another voice, a voice which had dreams and aspirations, and this voice was at loggerheads with the voice of society. The dilemma that resulted from this is what is portrayed in this poem, written by a relative who is able to understand the internal conflict of Aunt Jennifer and portrays it in a tone with great pity and sympathy for this woman caught at a juncture of history where a woman's dreams did not receive the recognition that it was due. Aunt Jennifer's longing to escape from this world which she finds intolerable is done through a marvelous tapestry which she creates, in which there are beautiful topaz tigers against a background of verdant green, which captures the life and color that's so sorely missing in her own life. Her life is dull, boring and static, and that life which she wants to escape is what she pictures through her embroidery in the tapestry. Through the portrayal of the tigers in the tapestry, the poet is able to contrast Aunt Jennifer's situation, her real situation, with her aspirations which are in her dreams. The opening line of the poem locates Aunt Jennifer in a well-to-do family. Those tigers are prancing about on a screen. In how many households across the world would you find a screen? Probably not too many, only wealthy households where people could afford to buy a screen and the women had the luxury of time to embroider. So it's not a lack of money which bogs Aunt Jennifer down. She has enough and more to spare of that. But what she is lacking is the freedom to allow her spirit the free rein which it so desires. In Aunt Jennifer's panel, the tigers are free, whereas Aunt Jennifer perceives herself as being bound up. She is in a cage, locked in by boundaries imposed by a social order against which her spirit rebels, longing to break free into liberty. In fact, in stanza 3, she sees herself as a tiger too, but not a tiger who's free and wild, but a tiger that is in captivity to a master. The scene in her tapestry captures what she wants to be in life: fearless, assertive, noble and powerful like the tiger. The tigers depicted as prancing across the screen bring to mind a being that is light-hearted, self-assured and happy, all the things that Aunt Jennifer is not. Her panel contains animals that are more confident, more contented than she is. There is a certainty about them that their maker lacks in herself. The poem says that Aunt Jennifer embroiders tigers that are confident, self-assured dwellers or denizens of this green land. Now the word denizens is taken from the word citizens, but it is slightly different. The use of bright colors in the tapestry again points out to the difference between the dreams and aspirations that Aunt Jennifer held dear compared to the reality that was her life. The topaz tigers, that yellow, represents the burning fire and energy of the sun, and the green stands for the vibrancy, the vitality of life, of spring and of rebirth. In comparison to these, Aunt Jennifer's life is just full of dullness. It is totally colorless, and it's placed there deliberately to show forth that contrast through the poem. In the tapestry, the tigers seem unafraid of the men who are sitting beneath the tree. But in reality, Aunt Jennifer lives in terrible fear of all men, and in particular, she lives in dread of her husband. The tigers remind the poet of knights. Knights are supposed to be brave warriors who are filled with the quality of chivalry. Chivalry means those people who show great respect and honor towards women, even going to the greatest lengths of laying down their lives in order to protect women from harm and danger. Now, this is in complete contrast to Uncle as he is portrayed in the poem, because if Aunt Jennifer lives in fear of men in general, and in particular she is terrified of Uncle, then there definitely must be some reason for that. She has probably been the victim of physical abuse, or definitely the victim of verbal abuse. This is in direct contrast to the tigers and their chivalry as represented in the poem, that they appear as knights to the poet. Stanza 2 portrays Aunt Jennifer's situation as it was at that point in time. It says that her fingers were fluttering through the wool. Fluttering speaks also of shivering. Possibly she was nervous and maybe she was weak. Both of these come together to bring in an image of battering, perhaps not physical battering, but emotional battering for sure. The stanza continues to say that Aunt Jennifer found it hard to even pull the thread through the needle. And this image takes us straight back to the days of slavery. If you have ever seen a movie which represented olden days when slaves worked in the galley of a ship pulling the oars in order to make the ship move onward and forward, or if you have seen slaves pulling huge big burdens on their backs with great difficulty, these are the images which the poet wants to take us back to in saying that Aunt Jennifer found it hard to pull a thread through a needle. How hard could it be to pull the weight of a thread through a needle? It's obviously not to be taken literally, but it's an image of how difficult she found her life to be. It was like slavery. It was like being in bondage. It was like every movement of hers was being done because she was being forced to do it. She was being constrained and compelled into doing that activity. The ivory needle again reinforces the fact that probably Aunt Jennifer came from an upper middle class family, because ordinary women would use steel or plastic needles. But apparently she was no ordinary woman. She had a relative, a close one for sure, who had brought her back an ivory needle from Africa. So again we are told that it's not because of financial difficulties that Aunt Jennifer found her life difficult, but the reasons were different. This verse speaks of the massive weight of Aunt Jennifer's wedding ring upon her hand. This is a figure of speech known as a hyperbole. A hyperbole is an exaggeration which is used for effect. How heavy can a wedding ring be? It probably weighs maybe 4 to 5 grams at the most. But the wedding ring on Aunt Jennifer's finger felt like it was too heavy a burden for her to bear. Now obviously the poet is trying to point to the oppression that she felt that was coming through this marriage, symbolized by her wedding ring. Not just her husband, Uncle, as he is portrayed in the poem, but the whole of society and all of the expectations that come together from a society that makes her feel as if she is weighed down and her spirit is being crushed under the pain of this expectation which she is unable to fulfill through her life, but must, because she cannot escape except through the world of art into the world of her dreams and her aspirations, which she does through that tapestry which features the tigers. By stating that it is Uncle's wedding band, the poet wants to suggest to us that although Aunt Jennifer is wearing the wedding ring, it still belongs to Uncle. Now there are two ways that we can read this. The first is that Aunt Jennifer, although she's wearing the wedding ring, hasn't taken total ownership of the matrimonial relationship and its implications. She hasn't been able to accept what matrimony would bring to her in that day and age. And the other implication is that just as the ring still belongs to Uncle, in placing it on Aunt Jennifer's finger, he assumes that Aunt Jennifer also belongs to him. So by doing this, Aunt Jennifer is reduced to a piece of property or a commodity that now is owned by uncle. So she's no longer her own person, she's no longer her own being, and in having lost that identity to be who she is, she must now succumb to the identity of uncle. Therefore, Aunt Jennifer cannot do what she wants to do, but she must do what uncle wants her to do. She has to do what society wants her to do. How does she cope with such a life? By living vicariously through her art and through her paintings. The use of the words massive and heavily again point out to the fact that possibly this burden of marriage and this burden of matrimonial expectations from society is more than Aunt Jennifer can bear. It looks like she's on the breaking point, and possibly that's the reason that she has aged early and maybe gone to an early death, because when we meet her in stanza 3, she is already dead. The poet makes use of several images that sharpen the contrasts which exist in the poem to increase and heighten the effect of these polarities. Aunt Jennifer's fluttering fingers contrast sharply with the strong lines of strength and muscle in the moving tigers. We can almost feel their strength coming through, and we can feel the weakness and the trembling of Aunt Jennifer's fingers. There is a contrast in the type of images which the poet uses as well. She uses kinesthetic images to show the tigers prancing about. In other words, images that depict movement. And when she's describing Aunt Jennifer, those are static images which show her in one place, as if her life itself has come to a standstill. So while her life is at a standstill, the art and the imaginary world that she has created, that is moving on. That's another contrast in the poem. In the tapestry, the tigers are depicted as being completely free and unafraid, whereas in the poem, Aunt Jennifer is far from free. In fact, she is in bondage even after she has died. Even in death, the image of the wedding ring dominates the scene. And the poet says that she is ringed in by her master. This brings in the image of the circus, wherein a master trainer controls and directs the activities of animals for the entertainment of the public. One would imagine that death at least would have freed Aunt Jennifer from this misery, but the predominance of the symbol of the wedding ring shows us that even in death, she seems to be constrained by all the boundaries that were set upon her during her life. The whole image of being suffocated in marriage comes together in that one symbol of the wedding ring dominating the laid out body of Aunt Jennifer just before she's being taken for her burial. The use of the words ringed and master in the same quatrain strongly suggests a metaphor from the circus. In a circus, a master trainer trains dangerous animals to perform certain tasks in order to entertain an audience. The audience has preset expectations of what the animal is going to do, and the animal will never break through those expectations or the training which it has received from its master. So, for example, if a master trainer has brought in a tiger and trained it to jump through a ring of fire, or maybe to climb up a ladder, or to do certain tricks with other tigers, that is all the tiger will do. The tiger can never at any point in the program see a cute kid and go off to do a friendly gesture to that kid. Oh no, if the tiger did that, then it would be severely reprimanded and punished. In the same way, the audience here is symbolic of society. Society has certain preset expectations of women, and in particular of married women. And if women make infringements of those expectations, if they go outside those expectations, then society can be very harsh in reprimanding and punishing women who break through those boundaries. So the ring represents the boundaries which women have enforced on their life by certain institutions like marriage and certain people like society. And women cannot break through those and go out and do whatever they feel like. By using this image, the poet is saying in effect that a woman's life becomes reduced to an act or a performance wherein she is doing everything that she is being directed to do, that she has been trained to do, or that she is being expected to do. So there is very little scope for her to fulfill her own dreams, her own desires, her own goals, or her own expectations of life. So if a woman does nurture such aspirations, then what does she do? She has only one of two choices. Either she gives them up, or she fulfills them through virtual reality of art. So vicariously, she sees herself as free, powerful, liberated by painting those tigers in the embroidery of the tapestry. And that's the reason that the poem ends with this sharp contrast of the life of disillusionment that Aunt Jennifer led, whereas the tigers, because they have been immortalized through her embroidery, will forever be free. They will forever be prancing around, and they will forever be unafraid of men. They symbolize all that Aunt Jennifer wanted to be. They stand for all that Aunt Jennifer wanted to do. They are all that Aunt Jennifer wished she could be. But since none of that could be, it was to her encapsulated in that art form forever. Adrien Rich's poem, Aunt Jennifer's Tigers, is all about the suppressive and oppressive nature of marriage and how society attempts to control the lives of women and married women in particular, so that life for them, just in struggling to cope with the rules and regulations that they are bound in, becomes suffocating and stifling. Unless they can find a way to vent out their frustrations, life for women would be very, very traumatic. The first verse of the poem describes the fearless tigers Aunt Jennifer creates in needlepoint. Their freedom and dignity is contrasted in the second verse to the restrictions of marriage, symbolized by the wedding band that weighs down Aunt Jennifer's fingers as she shows. The themes are resolved in the final third verse. Even death will not free Aunt Jennifer from her ordeals, but the tigers she has created will continue to appear proud and unafraid. Her dreams must remain forever in the realm of virtual reality or art.